Hello, and welcome to Senior Code Review Buddy. Today I'm going to talk about indentation and how reducing it can help improve readability. This was something I remember from one of my earliest code reviews. I had this large function, and before I was able to do anything, I needed to validate 2 or 3 things from the input variables. So I had some nested if statements checking these conditions, then the main body of my function indented 2 or 3 levels, and then the else conditions where I handled logging when the validation checks failed. And when I sent this PR out for review, one of the first comments that I got back was that I should flip the logic of my if statements. Instead of having these 3 if x, they should be if not x. And then I could have the code that handles the validation written right below the if statement instead of at the end of the function. And then I wouldn't need to indent the main part of my function. I made the changes, and it really stuck with me how much better my function looked. All my error detection and handling was grouped together at the top, and then most of my function was no longer so heavily indented. So I've got 3 examples now that I'd like to walk through, showing what this can look like. Alright, we've got a simple little function here, get file contents. Given a file path, if the file exists, we read the contents of it and we return it. If the file doesn't exist, we just return none. It's a pretty small function, and it's pretty easy to read at a glance, but I think we can still improve it. Going in with the theme of reducing indentations, one thought is we could flip around this if statement. So instead of if it is a file, we could say if not a file, and at this point we can just return none right away. And then we can unindent these lines. Yeah, because we know at that point that file path is a file. It's also kind of clear now that we don't need contents at this point. We can just return directly here instead. And with that, we have the function that just looks like this. We get a file path. If it's not a file, we return none right away. Otherwise, we open and return it. So we got this, and I think it's a bit cleaner and easier to read. Let's jump over to example 2. Alright, here we've got some code that is heavily inspired by my initial experiences around indentations. We're given a user ID, a transaction ID, and a date. And we want to just validate these 3 values before recording the transaction. We do it in 3 different if statements because we do want to log an error specific to each of these checks failing. Well, this works. It's not super easy to parse what's happening. Looking at this, it just feels a bit complex and hard. It's also a bit tricky to confirm that we have the correct log error for the right statement. Looking at them, we are good here, but if you were to make changes, add more, fill up this with more code, it could be harder to find them. I think though this example is a pretty easy one to fix, going back on what I have talked about. We just flip them all around and handle the errors right away. So instead of if it's a valid user, if not a valid user, and you can see there that I even copied the wrong error message, showing that I wasn't even thinking of which one it was. So we've got that. And we do want to have a return here because we don't want to continue. That is one of the advantages you get when you sort of have it at the end. You just kind of naturally fall through. And then we no longer need to indent this at all. It just happens. And we end up with this, which I think compared to our initial example is a lot easier to read. It's very simple to see that, okay, we check to see, is it a valid user? If not, log an error, return. Is it a valid transaction? If not, oops. If not, log an error, return. And if the date is in the future, also log an error and return. I think this also shows the value in having unit tests you can run to make sure that when you make changes like this, you aren't like me and mixed something up and switched it around. But I think this looks much easier than our initial one. And with that, let's go to our 3rd and final example. Example 3 is something I've pulled from a personal project I have. This function, getAlbum, is given a file path which points to a podcast file, and it returns the album name from that podcast file. Let's sort of go over this at a high level, how the function does this. So it starts off by extracting the extension from the given file path. If it's an MP3, we've got some code here that handles extracting the album name. If it's an M4A, we've got some code here that extracts that. And if it's neither of them, we raise an exception because we don't know how to handle that. As I described the function that way, I think it's pretty clear that I've got two helper functions here. I've got this code, getAlbum for MP3, and this code, getAlbum from M4A. So I think we should probably just extract both of those there. So get, because they just need the same input, and they just return a simple string. They don't really interact with anything outside. And we reduce the level of indentation because they're just in the function now. They're not nested in part of the other function. getAlbum M4A, file path. And then here, we just need to call them. So return and just by extracting those two helper functions, we've reduced the overall indentation we have, and I think it also really helps the readability. getAlbum is now a really easy function. You just extract what the file extension is, you call into a helper if it's MP3, call into a different helper if it's an M4A, and you raise an exception otherwise because we don't know how to handle those right now. All the details about how exactly we extract this for an MP3 or an M4A, they're hidden within these helper functions, so when you're dealing with how an MP3 does it, you don't have to worry about how the M4A does it. I think that also by having these helper functions, it's kind of, the code's clearer overall, and it's easier to see some other issues we could maybe fix. Like looking at this M4A, it's like, oh yeah, I've got this magic string here. I probably shouldn't have a magic string here. This should probably be a variable. And looking at the flow for the MP3 code, it kind of just feels off. Like it's sort of got, as I talked about, we're kind of handling an error condition here at the end, which maybe is not the right spot to do it. But I think those are issues maybe to dig into in a future episode. Thanks for walking through this code with me today. If you have any comments, code you'd like me to review, or ideas you'd like me to talk about, please leave a comment below or reach me at chris@seniorcodereviewbuddy.com. Thanks, and have a great day.